All right, so do we have to just do a quick intro?
Forgotten how to do it.
Yeah.
Go.
This is Crim City, and I'm Mark Murray.
I'm Josh Hanrahan.
And today we're going to start talking about this thing that's now happening in the bikie world a lot, patching over, which years ago resulted in death. Now it just results in publicity and money for whoever does it.
Okay, Moz, let's start this week's episode of Crim City with a quick crash course on Australia's bikie culture.
There are nearly 30 what are considered outlaw motorcycle gangs, as the way police actually tag them. And there's a hierarchy, isn't there?
Well, that's brilliant. I could not name you 6, I don't reckon. So thanks for saying there's 30.
So the hierarchy used to be the rebels. The rebels had huge numbers. Comanchero, Hells Angels and Bandidos. And now the Lone Wolf, the Nomads, they're the kind of big 6. And then there are other little peripheral ones like the Fourth Reich, very big down in Wollongong. The Finks.
The Mongols still have a pretty strong base in Queensland and Victoria.
And the Finks, likewise, were very big in northern New South Wales and the Gold Coast, but they're spreading their wings. There's a good dozen that are really hardcore out of the 30. Some are small, they're feeder clubs, some come and go. Like, I remember there was a bikie club called the Phoenix, and I think they didn't quite rise the way that they expected to.
That's one of your better ones.
Yeah, it is. I've got an intellect. There was another really violent Dutch club tried to come over and establish it here called Saboteur. Cops smashed them very quickly. Some of these guys declare themselves as bikies, and the clubhouse is a garage out the back, some bloke's house, literally. Whereas the Nomads, in their day, their clubhouse, they'd spend like $100,000 in an industrial area converting a warehouse, and they'd have strip poles, they'd have a special bar.
Real Sons of Anarchy type setup. Moz, explain, what does patching over mean in the bikie world?
It's moving to another club. And there's money involved, right? They will entice somebody to their club by offering them more money or a different position or something like that. But patching over is literally wearing a Bandido banner and then going over to wear the Hells Angel banner. Up until recently, that could get you seriously hurt. There were stories of bikies. They would brand you to take off the tattoo of the club.
Yep.
I did a court case where a rebel had decided that he was leaving the club. He was kidnapped, had his motorbike taken off him, and had the living shit kicked out of him, right? Because that is considered disloyal. Now, we have just covered recently patching over a guy called Jason Fay, who is a well-known Bandido. I bumped into somebody on Anzac Day who may or may not have had a criminal background, who said to me, there's a photo of Jason Fay, this Bandido, with a whole lot of Hells Angels. He said, it's got to be a joke. And I mentioned it to you. After that, we started doing a bit of digging and discovered.
No joke.
No, he had patched over to the Hells Angels. Now, that's a big thing because at the moment we're finding the Hells Angels are actually in a bit of an expansion mode, aren't they, in Sydney?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because Sydney's bikie landscape, if you wanted to call it that, has been dominated for the best part of, how long would you say, Moz? 3, maybe going on 4 years, really, by the rise of the Comanchero. I think I've just stolen a line that you used in the war there. I remember you saying something like
Wouldn't
that.
Wouldn't be the first one you've stolen.
But really, the Comanchero Outlaw Motorcycle Group have been working incredibly hard and incredibly diligently to control Sydney's drug market. And Sydney's drug market is the most profitable in Australia. And for that reason, they've not only found themselves to be very powerful, but also found themselves to be the number one enemy of police, which has led to the arrest of several senior Comanchero figures.
Across the country.
Including
the big one, bringing back Mark Buttle, who was the major figurehead and has been since the last 10, 12 years. So
yeah, totally.
The Hells Angels have tried to jump into that void created by what, everyone loves to call a power vacuum, a bit of a cliche, but that's what it is. Similarly, I remember 2013, a guy from the Bandidos, again, had crossed over, a guy called Suvat Sikalamiu. I'm not sure he's Turkish. He went over to the Hells Angels, and quite an interesting little character. I did meet him once because we had a bit of a dispute about something I'd written. Basically, he was a bit pissed off by the fact I'd gone out on a police raid and we got photos of him and police knocking on his door without a key and dragging him out, and there was a block of units at Mascot. And he got upset about that because he didn't want me to start writing where his suburb was. So we ended up having coffee and we chatted about it, and he said, look, I don't mind you having a go at me. He said, but it's my family live there and I'm worried. The commos are after me. He was in the middle of a war. And he said, can we not do that? So we started talking about problems with the HAs, and there'd been some shootings. And he was telling me there was a famous shooting on New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve, there's a harbour cruise. Now, this harbour cruise was on a thing called the Oscar II, a super cruiser worth probably, $10,000 a night for that night. And on it was the elite of Sydney's underworld.
Yeah.
There was Pascal Barbaro,
Yep.
no longer with us, sadly to say. Adam Freeman, who was about to go to jail. And in fact, the rumour was that was a farewell for him to go. And Suvat was telling me all of this, and he said when they pulled up at Rose Bay, there was a gunman waiting to try and knock off some guys, and there was also a Brothers for Life war going at the time. The target, they believe, was a Brothers for Life character. And Suvat said, mate, we came out, the cops were there, and there was all these TV crews and photographers, and he said, I was shitting myself. I said, why? He said, well, it wasn't so much being photographed with these guys, but there were all these women that were on board. And if my wife saw me with them, I was in really big trouble. And I'm thinking, really? It was a real insight that this guy didn't care that he was on a boat that was being shot at with half of Sydney's underworld. He was more worried about his wife maybe getting the wrong impression the girl next to him had been on the boat with him or something like that.
Well, fair enough.
That, again, was in the middle of a war.
Yeah.
I mean, Sydney's always in conflict. At the moment, because of people considering that the Commos might be a bit weak, the rebels, the Bikies, they have never got to the heights that they had when they were under Alex Vella. Mm-hmm. And Peter Dutton got Alex Vella good.
He did. Explain that.
Well, Alex goes over to Malta, where he is from, as he's been doing on and off for 100 years. And I think you'll find behind the scenes the gang squad under Deb Wallace were working to make sure that Alex Vella, who was a major, major figure, you've got to remember the rebels were the biggest club in Australia. What they did is, because he didn't have Australian citizenship and he'd never done it, even though he was in like 50 or 60 when he went over and been going backwards and forwards as a kid, they cancelled his re-entry visa on the grounds that he wasn't of good character. Mm. And he's fought that to the High Court. He's done everything, but he's stuck. Mm. And soon after, the rebels, they then lost their sergeant-at-arms to natural causes, and they just never really recovered.
If we can go back to Suvat for a second, how often do you have sit-down coffee meetings in your diary with bikies?
No, hardly ever, really. This one was just because I knew his lawyer, and he wanted to explain to me that he was always getting pulled over by the cops, and he said they were always threatening to breach him because he'd moved, like his bail conditions would say, this is the address you've got to live at. Mm-hmm. And they said, where are you living? And it wouldn't correspond. And they said, well, we're going to breach you. You got to go and change it. And he said, oh, fuck, I'm not changing it, mate. He said, I go to the RTA, or back then, or the RMS. He said, mate, the minute my real address goes into that computer, I'm sure someone from the Commos will have it. He said, I'd rather you breach me. He said, I don't give a fuck. Because he said they're everywhere. Probably knowing, because he's probably got people doing exactly the same thing. Or not him, but those outlaw motorcycle gangs. So I had another sit down with Sleeman Toujours from the Nomads.
Yep.
At the same coffee shop, actually. It was only because he had the same lawyer. I think the coffee shops and the lawyer are on retainer. There was him, the sergeant-at-arms, and I didn't realise they had to have a special meeting to get a resolution passed to talk to me. He wanted to explain they were fighting the consorting laws.
Which is when Raptor came in and started, making life...
Kicking the shit out of bike and making life...
That's not how I was going to say it.
You were going to say making life difficult. They kicked the shit out of them. They, in a very legal way, made life unbearable to the point where you don't see the famous bikie run, 200 motorbikes tearing down a highway, all with their colours. It's really quite dramatic, but they put an end. The consorting laws did that. Cops had just set up roadblocks. They pull them over. If you were hanging around with anybody that had two guys with criminal records, you weren't allowed to consort. So they couldn't do their bikie runs in New South Wales. So Slim and Tijua, we sat down. He wanted to explain why they were fighting the consorting laws. And seriously, they took it to the High Court, fighting it on human rights.
Yeah.
They were using the case of a disabled guy who was knocking around with a whole lot of people with records. And they had issued a consorting law for that. And he said, we're fighting it on his behalf. It was really very clever.
Yeah.
It was not just about bikies. They were taking up the cause for everybody, for the man in the street, so they could, Anyway, so the consorting laws, they lost.
Yes.
Poor old Sleeman and his mates, they have a lot of trouble riding around with their colours. So they stopped having their famous bikie runs here in New South Wales. So I found out, I got a phone call saying the Bandidos are going to have their big national run down in Tasmania, right? So I booked myself on the Spirit of Tasmania, and it's quite hilarious. So I've got on there, I mean, no bikies, but you see these bikes going on here and there. And we took off from Melbourne, right? And then as we're crossing the Bass Strait, all these guys must have gone into their rooms, got changed, and came out in their Bandido colours. it was like going to a fancy dress party.
I just thought it was interesting to ask you about that, sitting down for a coffee with a bikie, how often that happened, because I know I got a
couple of times now.
Yeah. Well, I got a message to my personal Instagram last week, and they said, love your work. Do you guys ever get scared about, what you're covering? And so I thought, it was just interesting when you mentioned that, somebody, this individual had contacted you and wanted to sit down and chat. It's not something that happens all the time.
No, and we don't chase it.
No.
Both of these were quite controlled. I've met a few others.
Yeah.
Like the guy that told me about Jason Don. I literally met him in the pub. He said, I know who you are. And we started talking.
Mm-hmm.
That happened also, remember, at the Strawberry Hills with the guy who put me in a headlock because he didn't like what I wrote. That wasn't as nice as when the guy at the Watson's Bay wanted to buy me a beer. I prefer that sort of interaction with them.
Well, no, but that was,
than the headlock one.
It only cost me $50 to get you put in a headlock. So that's money well spent.
Yeah, I was wondering how he knew I was at the Strawberry Hills, which I don't go to anymore if you're listening.
Well, no, I just thought that message was an interesting one because it's a question we get asked a lot. Do you get scared? And my response is always, well, we don't take the business of underworld figures or bikies or anything like that. We stand on the outside and report on what we hear from police, criminals, whoever it may be. And
we verify, I hear about a major figure patching over. I don't just take that guy's word for it. I talk to you. You got it confirmed by a couple of different sources. I then also went to a couple of very senior police, came back and said, yeah, you're right. You guys are on the money. I mean, it's all different. Like I said, that came from a pub conversation. Yep. Sometimes it comes from an anonymous email. Sometimes it comes from a very trusted source. We have had our issues with safety. Not huge, I don't think.
No.
These guys, in the end, most of them are in this for business, and they know hurting somebody with public profile like a police officer, a journalist or a politician is going to bring undue attention. At least that's what I'm hoping. I'm very seriously hoping. Josh, why do you think Jason Fay's got the publicity he has for moving over to the Hells Angel?
Because the Fay name was synonymous with the Bandidos bikie gang. His brother John was up to the sergeant at arms at one point. The Bandidos were a big deal, and the Fay brothers were a big deal in the Bandidos. So when you've got high-profile members of a club switching to other clubs, it's like any kind of sport. If the biggest player in your footy team went to another footy team, it's a big deal, and that's essentially what we're playing with here. The Hells Angels' intentions are expansion at this point. The police certainly seem to think that or be concerned about that too. I was told a few weeks ago that the Hells Angels had moved into Brighton Les Sands, which was
Comanchero stronghold for decades.
It was essentially the home of the Comanchero.
It was the birthplace for Mick Howie. That is their area.
So to hear that the Hells Angels were moving into that area in particular was a real show of force because, you've got to be bold because moves like that in the bikie world are often not taken very lightly by whoever's territory you're trying to take. And so we heard that and I mentioned it to you and you spoke to people as we do and they said, yeah, that sounds about right. But the most incredible thing I thought was when I Googled it and found that the Hells Angels have an official website, which was, like any kind of organisation around the world, you go to Hells Angels World and it's there and they list their chapters around the world, what year they were created. And there it was. In March 2023, the Hells Angels opened a Bayside chapter and there's a map of Sydney with exactly where that Bayside chapter is and it's in the Brighton-Les Sands area. So we've written also off the back of that, of looking through things about how Sydney has not been a Hells Angels stronghold for long.
I actually think before you can even open a chapter, it would have to be sanctioned from head office. So it'd be interesting to think if this expansion is being driven by headquarters.
They opened their first chapter in Sydney in 2011, whereas I think they opened their first chapter in Australia in Melbourne in about 1975.
I do remember them being really strong in Melbourne.
In Victoria,
the Hells Angel had the really big mistake. I mean, it goes back to, there was the Wild Rolling Stones concert, 69, I think. The Hells Angels made it there. They were hired as security for this concert. And in the ensuing concert, there was a person killed. And then Hunter S. Thompson glorified them. He went on tour with the Rolling Stones, but he also kind of joined the Hells Angels. And that gave the name of Bikies the romance, which has been destroyed recently. But up until around 2000, I think they were considered rebels without a cause. It wasn't until after the 90s that they started to become known as major criminal networks.
If you look at on their website, as funny as it may be, we've seen a real rapid growth over the past decade. And now with the Comanchero on their knees, why wouldn't that continue? And we're hearing talk of plans and we're seeing people like Jason Fay joining. So it's all pointing in that direction in terms of the Hells Angels becoming a bigger threat than they have been previously.
Thanks for listening to Crim City. I'm Mark Murray.
I'm Josh Hanrahan. This episode's been produced and edited by Jasper Leake.
And executive producer Dan Box.
As always, you can see us weekly on TikTok. We go by the same name there, Crim City, but that's on the Daily Telegraph's TikTok page. For more crime stories, go to dailytelegraph.com.au.